All right, I think I'll kick us off here. And so thank you so much for joining us this morning. We have a whole wide variety of breakout sessions going on right now where we're going to be diving deep into a number of different issues that are critical for advancing growth, investment, productivity, and prosperity in Canada. And this one I'm particularly excited about. I mean, as we all know too well, communicating issues around growth, productivity, and policy is hard. But it is essential. Effective communication is foundational to almost all policy choices before us. And communicating complex ideas is more important now than ever. But it is also more difficult. Okay, we all know that great policies only succeed when they have public understanding and support. But in an age of constant information overload, it's increasingly tough to cut through the noise. Hot takes often overpower thoughtful discussions. And so today's session is about tackling that challenge head on. How can we communicate vital ideas in a way that resonates and drives sustainable improvement in policy? And so to help us explore these questions, I'm thrilled to introduce Scott Crockatt, who will be facilitating our next discussion and conversation on these issues. So Scott is the Vice President of Communications and External Relations at the Business Council of Alberta and leads their effort to bring Council's policy solutions to a broader audience, very much in the spirit of what this summit aims to do. So please join me in welcoming Scott, who will introduce the panel and lead the discussion.
Thanks a lot, Tony. Great. Thanks very much for that, Trevor, and thanks everyone for joining us today. I'll introduce our panel in a few moments. I hope everybody's ready to have a little bit of fun actually here today, because when the panel assignments first came out and we were looking at what we were going to be talking about, I think everyone on this felt like we have the best time slot, right when everybody's still fired up and warmed up in the morning of the first day, on probably the most important topic with some of the best people in the country to talk about it. So I'm just going to grab a seat over here and I'll invite up my panelists. So as you've probably seen on the information before today, we have an incredible panel for you. There's three individuals who really need no introduction, but I'll invite them all up now. We got David Coletto from Abacus Data, Hannah Thibedeau, who many of you would know from more than 2 decades at CBC and now with Global Public Affairs, and Tony Keller, obviously legend of the Globe and Mail. And so you could say that we've got the columnist, the communicator, and the pollster up here. And I'll try and wrangle them and keep them in line today. I'm really excited about this session, which is about communicating policy, communicating productivity, because in many ways I think that this is the ball game, or at least a big part of the ball game. When we think about what was talked about earlier today, a question kept resonating in my mind, which is the issue developing the good ideas, or is the issue getting public acceptance and buy-in for those good ideas? Perhaps it's a bit of both, but I'll look forward to your perspectives on that. So just to kind of get things started, I'm going to give you each a chance, if you would, to kick things off. Tell us a little bit about you, but more than anything, when we're talking about communicating, it starts with who we're communicating to, right? Which is Canadians. So I'd ask you each if you could set the context for us. What is on the minds of the Canadians that you talk to, that you work with? David, you first with the data-driven perspective.
Well, thanks, Scott, and good morning, everybody. Good to be on this great panel. So I am David Coletto. I run a polling company called Abacus Data, and I always say I've got this amazing job in that I get to ask thousands of Canadians hundreds of questions every week. And so the thing that I'm always wondering is, what are they thinking, what do they believe, and what does that matter to their behavior and everything else? And I think when you ask Canadians today what's keeping them up at night, look at any poll, and one, they'll think the country's headed in the wrong direction. Two, that affordability, economic insecurity, and what I call this sense of scarcity that I think people believe has intensified a lot over the last number of years has shaped their mindset, right? And so to me, this conversation around productivity and raising the bar and improving people's standards of living comes at a time when I think most Canadians believe that that's under a lot of threat in their own lives. And so I think that context to me is a good way of starting and thinking about how do we communicate with people there.
I want to jump in on that for sure, because
Do
this
it.
is just, David and I have this roadshow, I think, now. I'm Hannah Thibedeau. I'm with Global Public Affairs. I'm their Executive Communications Officer. But as Scott was saying, I worked in the TV and broadcasting industry for 25 years. I had my own show on Canada's most watched news network on CBC for the past few years, 4 hours a day, 5 days a week. So the big thing is about communicating issues like this. And when you talk about productivity, if you say the words productivity, I think every non-economist is going to go, whatever. Right? And then picking up on what you're saying, David, so I was talking about that I walked into this room. One of the best things that I've been able to do over my years is talk with people. So how do we communicate this better? Because it's such a big issue. Every politician should be grasped with this right now. And I was talking with, and I want to just make sure I get the last name right when I walked into here. We're hearing words like GDP per capita. Look at what the Premier said. The Premier said we need to communicate this better. We communicate it in abstract terms. But I ran into Ryder Lee, and Ryder, you better be in here, because I was saying, you got to come in and watch this. He's with the Canadian Cattle Association. What about wealth per person? If we talk about it maybe in that terms and bring it back to the pocketbooks of Canadians, and I hate using the word pocketbooks because that's a word we use all the time, but household incomes, how do we make that better for everyday Canadians? And I think that's probably what we should start thinking about, is how to communicate this. And there's a big election campaign coming up here in Canada. Every politician should be jumping on this topic.
Tony, you're doing a battle every day on the opinion pages of Canada's largest newspaper.
Exactly. So let me tell a couple of stories to try to get at this problem of communicating what productivity is and even just understanding what productivity is. So 20 years ago, and a lot of people will probably remember this incident, Lucien Bouchard came out and said, Quebecers don't work hard enough. This is our economic problem. Quebecers don't work hard enough. It could have been applied to Canada. Canadians don't work hard enough. And he got all kinds of backlash, some of which was well-directed and some of which was poorly directed. He completely misunderstood what productivity is, what economic growth is, and what GDP per capita is. And that is the key. As someone said earlier, GDP per capita, GDP per capita, GDP per capita, GDP per capita. That's what you have to be talking about. The goal is not for everybody to work harder. It's for actually everybody to work smarter. And and therefore be able to do more with less and produce more with less. So let me tell a story that I think is very relevant for Alberta, which is agriculture in Canada. And I think that the history of agriculture in Canada kind of illustrates this really, really well. So a couple of months ago, I went back and I looked at the 1891 census. In 1891, when Canada had slightly less than 5 million people, the census said that 1/3 of the population were farmers. The most common job in Canada was farmer. The second most common job in Canada was farmer's son. And in fact, farmers' wives and farmers' daughters were not included in the labor force. If you included them, the labor force was probably 40 to 50% farmers. Fast forward 130 years. The Canadian labor force is about 1% in agriculture, and that is expected to continue to fall. Yet agricultural production and the value of agricultural production has gone way, way up. In 1891, Canada produced 60 million bushels of wheat. Last year, Canada produced 1.2 billion bushels of wheat with a much, much, much smaller labor force. So those are just sort of a couple of examples of how to think about this and how to talk about this. But I think Hannah is right that we have to be able to talk about this in a way where people understand what we're saying is not everybody has to work harder, and what we're not saying is some abstract thing about some abstract thing called GDP. We're talking about more wealth being generated in less time, possibly even by fewer people. The final story I'll tell is a few months ago I went, or actually I think it was last year, I went and I looked back, I looked at the data on productivity by country. And as others have mentioned earlier, Canada is now sort of in the 70% neighborhood, 70% of US productivity. And we're actually only keeping up that much with the US because we work really, really hard. It's the opposite of what Lucien Bouchard said. When you look at hours worked across the developed world, Canadians work almost as many hours a year as Americans. And one of the countries that I compared us to is Finland. Finland has the same level of GDP per capita as Canada. We're both 70-something% of the US level. But Finland is doing that while the average person works 200 hours per year less.
Wow.
So in other words, for us to keep up with Finland, we've had to work much harder. We've had to work an extra 5 weeks a year. Finland's working smarter, we're working harder to try to keep up with a more productive society.
I think you would have just sold that to Canadians. Have 5 more weeks off.
Yep.
Anyone interested
And I think
in that?
that's, yeah, and I think that's the pitch, is like you could be just as wealthy working less, or you could have to work more and more and more just to keep up.
And I mean, Canadians themselves use that language, right?
Exactly.
If you ask them today, do you feel like you're working harder and getting less? They themselves, at the micro level, will say yes to that, right? So I think we're already starting to uncover the way that you communicate it, because if they're feeling that at their own lives, in their own workplace, in their own effort, then just want to aggregate that up as a way.
Can I give an example of that?
Please.
Sorry, we're like, poor Scott.
No, be my guest.
I'm going to keep going. I have been traveling across this country for the past 10 days. I've been from Vancouver to Halifax to Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, the most southwest point, my hometown, back to Halifax, out to Calgary.
I can confirm this because I called you at some point. It's along that trip, and and the
it's true.
coverage was not good.
When I was in Vancouver, I was talking to an Uber driver. This Uber driver was telling me he wanted to work harder and make more money. So he learned to be a long-haul truck driver. But he was away from his family so much, the tax burden on him just was too much. He would have been making the same amount as he was as an Uber driver. So think about that productivity. We could have had him out on the road doing these long-haul truck deliveries to the United States, but instead, it didn't work out for him. So he decided, I'm going to drive an Uber because I'm going to make about the same amount of money and get to have some time with my family. And I hear these stories right across the country. A lot of Uber drivers tell me these types of stories.
Absolutely. Well, let's stay on the theme of what regular people think about this. And so whenever I think about communicating policy to regular people, I conjure the same image in my mind. Maybe you folks have something similar that you do as well. The image I conjure in my mind is if you drive 45 minutes directly south of where we are now, you'll hit a small town called Nanton. And Nanton has a fabulous truck stop with a bunch of tables in the back where people sit around and drink coffee and talk to each other. Ranchers, farmers, oil field workers, people that work in local manufacturing. And I've never once heard anyone at one of those tables talk about productivity. So
Not using the word productivity.
not using the word productivity. I've never heard them once use the word but they talk. They talk about society. They talk about their lives. They talk about what they want to live. I imagine they do the same in Yarmouth, Nova Scotia as well, and in Montreal, Quebec, and across this country. What do ordinary people think when we say we need to increase productivity? Tony, you've written about this. Maybe I'll go to you.
Yeah, so a while ago, my friend Keith Halliday from Boston Consulting Group sent me this study that Boston Consulting Group had done. Keith's on a panel tomorrow on international trade, no, later today, international trade. Anyways, Keith sent me this panel, and he said, this is crazy. Our results show that most Canadians don't want more economic growth. They don't want higher productivity. They're completely suspicious of this. They were kind of shocking, where only 5% of people think in this study thought the next generation of Canadians will be better off. But the answer to being better off would be higher economic growth, higher productivity, higher GDP per capita. Only 1/3 of the people in the survey thought economic growth is good. Only 1/3 thought it meant higher wages for low and middle income people, but 2/3 thought it meant higher income for the rich. Only 22% thought that economic growth would mean a more equal Canada, and 72% thought more economic growth would mean a higher cost of living, which would be bad for them. Now, these things seem really upside down, but I think it's because we've had 30 years, maybe more than 30 years, of both politicians and people confusing themselves about what productivity is, and politicians often saying, we need higher economic growth, we need higher productivity, and to do that, that means we need to cut government services, and we may need to cut taxes on business and on upper income people, and to pay for that we may have to cut government services. But don't worry, even though we're going to take away something that you want, it's for the good of the economy, this very abstract thing. And so I think a lot of Canadians and a lot of people around the Western world experience talk of higher economic growth as actually something bad is going to happen to them, when if we actually delivered truly higher GDP per capita and it was properly distributed, it would obviously be seen as a good thing. But I think a lot of people are not getting, they're not receiving the benefits, and it's being sold to them as a negative, basically.
I think it's just worth underlining what you said, because I almost fell off my chair when I first read it. Like, only a third of Canadians think economic growth is a good thing for them. And I think a lot of people in this room wake up in the morning and think, well, everybody must want economic growth. That seems reasonable. But David, Hannah, chime in on this. How do you think ordinary people, what do they hear when we say we need to increase productivity?
I want to chime in on, exactly what Tony was saying earlier. It's like, oh, I have to work harder. I have to work longer. That's what people think. I'm not sure that's the right way that governments should be selling it. I'm not sure even governments are selling it, because I was standing over there and it was, again, something that Jean-François Parot of the Scotiabank said. This is an issue that isn't seized by governments. I think this is an issue that absolutely needs to be seized by governments and business leaders. But when you talk about governments, when I was standing over there, it's like, how many of our cabinet ministers have productivity mentioned in their mandate letters? So I was standing over there.
Question.
I will answer that for you. It's mentioned twice, and we have more than 30 cabinet ministers in this cabinet currently. I think that needs to change. Maybe there even needs to be a minister of productivity where they focus directly on getting results from every piece of legislation that's put forward. It's just an idea, I'm throwing it out there, but in this election campaign, we need to hear that from our leaders, and not using the terms productivity because it doesn't really sink in. But it's going to be a prime time to bring it up. Media is going to be watching. There are lots of opportunities to get that message to the public, and in an election campaign, that might be the way to do it.
So I am the pollster on this stage, and so I have this privilege of being able to actually ask people what they think about something. So when I was invited to this summit, I said, okay, I'm going to do some stuff, because actually beyond that study, there's very little. Like, I tried to find what else has been done in terms of understanding what Canadians think of it. So I asked a few questions. The first is, only 9% of Canadians say they hear about this subject all the time. So it's not part of the lexicon. We're having conversations, I think, increasingly about it, but the broader public, those folks at N aren't talking about it, they aren't hearing about it, and so it's not coming up. And for the politicians, which I always say, it's not coming up at the doors. Right. No politician's knocking on a door and saying, hey, how you doing, what's up, how you feeling?
Oh, I'm really worried about productivity.
Yes, no, it's not there, right? Now, when you ask people unprompted, when you hear the term increasing productivity in Canada's economy, what does that mean to you? And you let them write anything they want, right? This is the ultimate test. And the answers are, depending on your perspective, surprising in the diversity of opinion. So it goes from people believing that when you hear that term, it means we need to increase domestic production of certain types of products. So whether that's food or energy or whatever things that they need, right? This idea that productivity is about what we produce. Others believe it's about them working harder. Literally, what do you mean? I need to work more. It means I'm going to have to, spend less time doing the things I like to do. And then there's a small, I would say, minority who actually understand what it means, or at least link it to a positive economic outcome, right? So the first point of this is if you wanted the Premier of Alberta to say, we're going to increase productivity, I would say most of her constituents would have no idea what she's saying. And when you then dig deeper and you say, well, do you think it's going to be a positive or negative to you personally? Depending on how you answered that question earlier, obviously will predict your response to that. And so I think we are at a point where before we can even get the country or our political leaders or others to engage in this, we do have to communicate to the public what it means and get them to say, I don't feel threatened by it. that this is something that I'm going to cheer everybody to try to achieve, because right now I think there's a subset, particularly young people, who think that it means I'm going to be automated out of a job. I am, going to have fewer and fewer opportunities. And you brought up truck driving. I always use this example. The #1 profession of men in Canada now is driving a large vehicle, right? And so when they hear autonomous vehicles, when they hear automation, I don't think they're going to be cheering for governments that are going to try to accelerate that kind of, quote, productivity.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges because, again, going back to my agriculture example, the way you get to higher productivity, which is higher economic growth, which is higher GDP per capita, which is more income for every person and a higher standard of living, is in fact you have fewer people producing more. In the case of agriculture, you have fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer farmers until eventually you have, relative to the Canadian population, almost no farmers, yet they're producing more food than ever. So truck driving is an example where, I mean, we do have to find a way to talk to people about this, because what we want to have happen is, like, it would be a huge productivity gain just to blue sky this if we had 0 truck drivers.
Can I just give a
sorry.
personal example
Go
first?
ahead.
So I have a team of 14 people. We are a consulting firm. You would think that AI, ChatGPT, I use it all the time, incredibly productive, makes me way more productive. But the moment I bring it up with my team and I say, you could use these tools, you could become more productive, there's an immense resistance to that idea. And it's not because they don't want to be more productive or they don't want to have more free time, because I'm not saying you need to work more hours, I just want you to be more productive. They then say, but if I learn how to use this and we integrate it more into our work, are you just going to replace me with it? And so that is, to me, an indicator of some of the resistance you're going to see more broadly.
It's also lack of understanding too, right? Not that they're not looking at what this is, but again, picking up on another issue from my travels across the country, we're talking about supply chain. I was talking to a fella in the West Coast, and he says he wants to implement AI into his port, and that would make productivity so much better. There's a huge fear of that. He said, I would create 2 jobs for the 1 job that I eliminated. So it's not actually eliminating all the jobs, but the union was concerned about this. So he can't implement that productivity because the union is pushing back on it. Their members don't want those new types of jobs.
And that's, if I can just jump in here, and that's an example of where you need really strong, well, it's even more, government policy and government supports for people who are going to be displaced by improvements in
But what
productivity.
you said was they weren't even going to be displaced. They were going to be retrained, put into these new jobs, but that's not the jobs they wanted. But it's a communications thing again, in particular when it comes to AI.
But the fear is clearly real, right? You've given 3 or 4 examples from
Yes.
3 or 4 different industries, and the natural reaction from everyone has been this sort of sense of fear. And I'm also enjoying that although you're not officially a journalist anymore, you've clearly interviewed people from coast to coast and also in the lobby on
In the lobby too.
on this topic. So I think we've done a reasonably good job of identifying the problem. Yeah. People don't understand productivity. They have a variety of strange definitions for what it means, and generally they're afraid of it and they feel negative about it. So let's flip that around. How can we talk to Canadians about this? How do regular Canadians talk about the concepts that sort of underpin productivity? What are the winning ways that we can get through to them?
Who do you want
You want me to jump in?
Sure.
So I think, again, the key is to talk about it not in terms of, sort of economist buzzwords, but just to say this is about trying to get to higher income and higher standards of living, or higher economic growth. Yeah, I think when we say productivity, eyes are going to glaze over. I think when we say GDP, people are going to say, I don't know what that is. Is that some kind of new disease? So I think it's about talking about higher incomes for everybody, higher standards of living for everybody. I will say, one caveat to that is there's GDP per capita does not actually mean how much everybody gets. It just means the total economic output divided by the number of people. So there are distributional issues, and I think they'll probably be talked about in some other sessions here, which may arise as we get into things like AI, where we'll be generating all this extra wealth, but there will be questions about, okay, well, how are we actually slicing up the pie? But again, to me, those are real questions for smart governments to think, smart democratic governments to think about. How do we make sure almost everybody or everybody benefits from the economic growth and the economic gains?
Hannah, how do you think regular people talk about productivity? How can we talk to them about it?
I think, so this room is great to have these discussions. That's a start. But being in the media over the past 25 years, I've seen a huge change on how we tell stories too, because journalists are so busy, they're being cut back, it's a very fractured media. You have to know where you want to deliver your message because it's very targeted now. I think you would probably agree with this too. Also, how do you get the message out to young people who aren't in traditional media anymore? They are not watching newscasts, they are not listening to radio, they're not reading newspapers. What they're doing is they're flicking on their phones. So you have to go where they are and you have to adjust to their attention span as well. So there are different ways to get it across. It depends on what message you want to get out there. Is it through a podcast? Is it through Twitter? Is not Twitter anymore, X, whatever he calls it now.
I refuse to change
Yeah,
calling it
kind
X,
of the
but
same
yeah.
as you. But you have to go where they are, and you have to communicate how they receive communications now. And it's thinking about those messages and tailoring those messages. But again, coming back to the terminology as well, we all still tell stories. Look, I've gone across this country and I want to talk about stories. We have done that from the beginning of time and we still do it now. Keep it very grassroots. If you have a story that compels a personal, story, there's always a beginning, a middle, and the end. But have a good opening and a good closing and tell them the facts in the middle. And right now for young people, you gotta keep it short. I have one more story. I was golfing in Whistler because I was out there and I'm playing with these two younger fellas. I'm like, where do you get your news? I'm just curious. They're like, we don't watch news, we don't read news, we don't get news. I'm like, what? He goes, well, we get it on, I don't know, Instagram and we flick through. TikTok. Who said TikTok?
TikTok.
You said
TikTok, yeah.
It's always TikTok. I said, okay, perfect. How long is that segment you watch? He goes, I don't know, 30 seconds at the most. What? 30 seconds. So you have to think of ways of communicating in that way. I'm not saying it has to be in 30 seconds because they continually go like this. If you grab them, you're gonna grab them. So there's all these different ways out there. This is what I'm kind of thinking about now, being behind the scenes and developing public policy and how to transmit that to people. But it's figuring out your target, where you want that message out, and then how do we do it?
Yeah. And David, how about from your perspective? Did your data show you anything in terms of how people think about productivity or the winning ways that you could talk to them about it if the open-ended answers were so abysmal?
Yeah, well, I think you always start with, like, where are people and what are they worried about today? Mm-hmm. And I think there's a direct link between their inability to access health services, their sense that they're falling farther and farther behind. Productivity is a solution to all of those things, right? We can't address our aging population unless we find a way to increase our productivity, right? We can't feel wealthier, even if the distribution isn't perfect, and maybe even, I think StatsCan said last week, the income inequality has risen to its largest point in 40 years. Those are the barriers to people believing that a room like us and business leaders and political leaders have their best interests at heart, which is part of the challenge. But you can overcome it by, I think, talking to people about, you can't solve all these things that you think are causing this sense of anxiety without addressing the fundamental piece of it, which is wealth creation. I mean, I don't know if any of you are Anglophiles like me and watched the UK election earlier this year, but you had the leader of the Labour Party, who's now the Prime Minister, say, one of my #1 priorities is creating wealth. When's the last time you heard a federal politician talk like that? Right?
Never.
Of any of the parties, let alone, a conservative.
Yeah.
And so, not to say we have to talk about wealth creation, but I think we have to change the lexicon about, not just splitting the pie up more equally, but increasing the size of that pie overall. And it's those basic things. So I think you come back to where people are, and you talk to them about why is it that they feel that they can't access a family doctor, or that government doesn't seem to be investing in infrastructure anymore, or whatever it might be, I think can come back to this. And I actually think, so in the same survey we did, almost half of Canadians believe, whether they understand what productivity means or not, believe Canada is worse than other countries. And so that conversation is moving the needle there, and the moment that the public recognizes that there's a problem we need to solve, then it becomes easier to bring them along, I think.
And I just want to follow up on something you were saying just a little bit earlier. On the left, we tend to talk about cutting up the pie, and on the right, we tend to talk about, oh no, we're going to make more pie. But those two sort of have to be brought together. We haven't done a really great job of creating more pie over the last 30-some years, with some real challenges to Canadian productivity and slowing economic growth across the Western world. In a lot of people's perceptions, we haven't, and in fact, in the data, we haven't done a great job of cutting up the pie more equally. So we've actually got slower growing pie and a less equal distribution of the slices. We kind of got the worst of both worlds. This is why when people are told we need more economic growth, they say, well, okay, but that's what you've been talking about for the last 20-something years.
Right.
I don't feel like it's going in the right direction. And also, to come back to the Lucien Bouchard thing, what gets pitched to them very often is, we need more economic growth, therefore you have to suffer. We need more economic growth, therefore we have to cut your services. We need more economic, and so it doesn't sound to them like it's something for them. It sounds like it's something for this abstract thing called the economy, which requires some benefits that will involve taking something away from them.
And to pick up on what David was saying too, we live in one of the most heavily taxed countries in the world. But if you look at our healthcare system, it is overstretched. We look at transportation. In Ottawa, for example, our public transit doesn't work half the time. If you could get that working better, you could get more productivity from people. And then also bringing our resources to market often takes twice as long as it does in the European markets. So if you can figure out all of those things, imagine how much productivity would be better for Canadians. And they're sitting there going, I can get my family doctor. I can get to work on light rail. All of those types of things. So those are the types of issues that stick in people's minds. If I can get on light rail and get to work and get home every day and it's reliable, that's great. But we're decades behind when it comes to public transportation.
That's true. It's partly because we decided to do every light rail system like a starting from absolutely scratch project in Canada, and we don't standardize anything.
I don't mean to bring up the issue of light rail.
I take your point as well. Let's broaden this out to some of the other policy issues that are a little bit beyond productivity but tied to it as well. And maybe we can start with affordability. You know, there's been a lot of discussion about affordability in Canada these days. It has a tie to productivity. David, is affordability still number one with a bullet at the top of the list? And what's kind of driving that, if yes?
Absolutely it is. I think when you combine just the general cost of living and housing, almost 9 in 10 Canadians put it as one of the top 3 issues they care most about right now. So it's still central to it. You know, a positive inflation figure that comes out this week doesn't solve the fact that groceries are still 20% more expensive today than they were 2 years ago, right? So
they're just not getting it more expensive as fast as they were before.
These things are lagging indicators, and the sense that people feel that their wages or their income has increased enough to change that perspective takes time. So I do think we're going to see this scarcity mindset continue at least for a number of years. But I think it goes to the core of how to talk about this. At the end of the day, if we increase productivity and we increase the amount we output relative to the effort we put into it, that's going to mean we have more left over at the end. That helps solve for the fact that you know, things are more expensive in people's minds.
Hannah, do you think that affordability offers us an opportunity to talk to Canadians about productivity in a way that politicians would actually hear at the door?
Absolutely. I think they're hearing it at the door all the time. This is what I'm hearing across the country as I'm traveling over the past 10 days, is just how people can't afford certain things. I'm going to give you another example. I'm in a ride from Halifax to Yarmouth because there is no other public transportation going there, and I'm sitting next to a fella, and he says, I have to work in Halifax, but I live in another town outside of Halifax. He works in Halifax because he makes more money, but he can't bring his kids there because then it's too expensive for him to have care, so he has to go home on the weekend to see his kids. So there's affordability right there. If you can tell that story and bring that example out, it's like, well, imagine if he could work in Halifax and have the care, have the availability, instead of keeping his family apart. You just bring all these stories together. So yes, he would listen if I could say, well, imagine if you got more time off, you got an increase in your pay, and you could bring your kids to live with you. But he can't afford even an apartment in Halifax to bring his kids there. So again, he has to go to a small town with his mom who can take care of the kids.
And, you know, and there have been some studies done on this, that there is a pretty strong connection between lack of affordability in highly productive cities and basically our suppression of productivity and economic growth. If more people could move could afford to move to places where they could earn a higher wage, which is kind of the definition of higher GDP per capita, they would, but they often can't because housing costs are so incredibly high in Toronto, in Vancouver, in San Francisco,
and
in New York. Halifax now has become one of those places. And so we're essentially hamstringing ourselves. So the housing affordability problem and the economic growth problem are actually connected, because what we're basically saying to a lot of people is, and again, the only studies I've seen on this are in the States, but in the States, you're basically saying to people, don't move to the San Francisco Bay Area, even though there are all these great jobs, because it's just too expensive. Don't move to Manhattan or New York City, it's too expensive. Try to start your business in some cheap housing market. That's highly counterproductive to do.
So if housing's related, let's talk about another related policy area. And one that I'm not sure I've ever seen an area of policy sort of move as quickly in the national consensus as this one, which is immigration. Connected to productivity, connected to economic growth. I feel like we had, for my entire life, 3 or 4 decades of Canadian consensus on immigration, and I feel like the ground underneath that has shifted in the last 18 to 24 months. Where do you think Canadians are at today on immigration? How are they talking about it in each of your worlds, in your polls, or in media and on your pages?
Well, maybe I can start it. I mean, it's been the quickest shift in public perception and opinion that I've seen in the almost 15 years that I've been doing it. So 18 months ago, about a third of Canadians thought Canada's immigration targets were too high. Today, we just finished a survey, it's 72%. Now, it's not going up, it's plateaued, but that's a doubling of the number who think we're welcoming too many people into Canada. And it's entirely tied to that scarcity mindset that I described, right? So people are not, most Canadians who are resistant to our immigration policy today, or the previous immigration policy, are not doing it because they're anti-immigrant or they're xenophobic or racist. There is some of that, and there always is everywhere. But it's a rational response to a feeling that we have just grown way too fast, and public policy primarily hasn't responded to solving it, whether it's housing, whether it's healthcare, whether it's any other thing that people feel they now are competing to get, which they didn't feel they needed to before. And so, in a strange way, and again, I'm not the economist to understand the effect, although from what I've read, the influx of low-income workers has disincentivized innovation from businesses. But I think we're entering a phase where there will be consistently strong headwinds to going back to a place where we're going to be able to welcome as many people as we did over the last 2 years, which will force businesses to actually innovate. So in a perverse way, public opinion is going to create an environment that's going to, I think, force some improvements in productivity, because no government, whether it's this current Liberal government federally or a Conservative one that might come after the next election, I think is going to be able to revert back to welcoming 1.5 million new people, even temporarily, into the country.
So the root of all of this, and God knows I've been writing about this a lot for the last 1.5 years, and when I started writing about it, no one else would touch it, and now everyone wants to talk about it, which is good. The federal government, the Trudeau government, and the Century Initiative misunderstood the difference between GDP and GDP per capita. They somehow came to believe that simply having a bigger economy was good, and so the higher temporary immigration went, the better it would be. They did not think through that, no, the only possible goal we have, there's nothing necessarily right or wrong with Canada having 100 million people, which is the long-term Century Initiative goal, but we have to think about, okay, well, what education level, what jobs, we have to think about how all this fits together. And the Trudeau government has essentially taken a pretty good immigration system and watered it down. So we are essentially, over the last few years, we have brought in a very large number of people primarily to work low-wage, low-skill jobs. That depresses GDP per capita, and which is why we've had 2 years of negative GDP per capita, which is unprecedented.
Which is actually the opposite of what our sort of economically driven point system that used to be the aim of the world was.
Bingo.
Was
So we actually did have arguably the world's best immigration system, which meant that we had actually somewhat higher immigration than the United States, quite a bit higher immigration than the United States, but we also basically had smarter immigration than the United States. It was really good. The Trudeau government flipped all of that.
Well, I was sitting at a press gallery dinner. That's where the press gather, and it's a yearly thing. And I was sitting on one side, I had a former governor of the Bank of Canada. On the other side, I had a finance minister. And this was about 5 to 7 years ago. And at that point in time, they were saying, in order to grow the economy, we need to bring in more immigrants. But we have seen over the past little bit, and the Trudeau government has somewhat admitted its failure because they're now limiting non-permanent residents. But it's interesting, you talk about the fact that are people getting a bit resentful of this, and I'd have to come back to what David was saying. In the East Coast, one of the biggest things, and it's only because I was just there yesterday, and I was talking with Premier Tim Houston, and he's big, of course, on getting more health care, fixing the health care system there. But what they're seeing in that province, Nova Scotians, is that it's affecting them. And that's exactly what David was saying. It's not anti-immigrant sentiment. It's the fact that they have to have services in place before they can, bring these numbers of people here. They're not doing it when it comes to the healthcare system, with the housing system, with infrastructure.
So, I'll ask you to comment on this first. You both described how Canadians are becoming increasingly concerned about the number of newcomers that have been welcomed into our country, and that, based on your experience, to date, that's mostly driven by things like absorptive capacity, where I'm going to find a doctor, where I'm going to live. How concerned are you, though, that may actually bridge over into anti-immigrant, racist sentiment, the things we've sort of seen in other countries about really sort of nationalistic, closed off? Are we at any serious risk of that?
I think we're absolutely at risk of that. I mean, at some point, in part because I think the political leaders have also aided and abetted the shift in mindset to blaming immigration for the reason why. I mean, the Prime Minister talks about bad actors at post-secondary institutions or elsewhere, but at the end of the day, the government set the policy. I do think that at some point when people are fighting over scarce resources, what started as a rational response to public policy becomes an irrational one. And so I think we do risk that long-term need. And I think as somebody looks at demographics, we are going to need to continue to be welcoming to immigration because our population's aging. We have no other way to counter that. And so we have to be very careful and cultivate and manage the public's perception of this, because if it does turn negative, it will have decades of lasting effect, I think, on what political leaders are going to be able to do around that policy issue.
So for what it's worth, my view is kind of different on this. I don't see signs of Canadians becoming, let's say, more racist or more intolerant of immigration. I think they're very specifically focused on what they see as the consequences of the policy of the last few years. They may not understand all the wrinkles of the policy, but they understand some of the negative outcomes. And if anything, I would say that, you may have noticed that the Federal Conservative Party never talks about immigration. Pierre Poilievre has just started to talk about it a little bit, but they spent the last several years under a kind of omerta of no one is allowed to talk about immigration. Why? Because they are afraid that the Liberals want to weaponize this and accuse them of being racist. So if anything, I'd say the dynamic's actually the opposite. which is we all want to be welcoming to immigration. We have to be welcoming to immigration. Immigration is a good thing. It's just the question of sort of quantity, scale, type, timing, what else do you do along with it? Those seem to me to be legit questions, but I just don't see it. I don't see a lot of sign that we have the kind of resistance to immigration that we're seeing in some European countries. I'm hoping that's not going to develop in Canada, and I don't see signs of it, of rejection of immigration outright.
I would say except in Quebec, maybe, where for the same reasons that Europe has been resistant, it's much more cultural. It's about protecting their identity as opposed to protecting my ability to buy a home, which are two very different reasons. But Quebec, I think, is unique in that place in our country.
Maybe I'll move us on to the last specific policy area that I wanted to touch on. You know, if we did a word cloud on what's been talked about here today, other than productivity, I would guess that internal barriers to trade might be one of like the largest words that's come up. I remember once earlier in my career approaching a friend who was a journalist and saying, "Oh, we just wrote this report," and the journalist was really interested. "Oh, what's it about?" And I said, "It's about internal barriers to trade." He literally threw his hands up, turned around, and walked away and said, like, "I don't ever want to write anything about that again. We've been talking about it for my whole career." So it might have been you. No. But Hannah, how could we talk about internal barriers to trade, one of the really obvious policy levers that with big, big numbers attached to it, in a way that a Canadian may actually care about or a journalist won't throw their hands up about?
I think the Premier had a really good example today when she's talking about wine, bringing in tangible discussions. How is it possible that we can't trade internally? It's just, if I'm at one liquor store, I can get French wine, but I can't get wine from other certain regions in Canada. How crazy is that? Simple as that. Keep it very, very simple. I think there was some Saskatchewan Premier Brad Wall, I think, told me at one point there's some type of pickle vodka too, that they figured out how to trade that. Sorry for whoever's in the room might know about this. But it's those silly issues. We're in the same country. We have to be able to do this in order to increase productivity, and sorry to use the word, but keep the stories going to explain it to Canadians that just how ridiculous these things are.
I think the Premier also didn't know the answer to a question she asked, which was, is it going to be better for the producer or is it better for the consumer? And
That's a great question.
I see an environment where at least the public policy makers, the elected ones, are talking far more about how does this affect the consumer? And so I think we're seeing a shift. I think a lot of the protectionist policies were often designed, use the wine industry in Ontario or in BC to protect those sectors, to protect the jobs there. And I think workers are still a big part of this question. But in an environment where affordability, where access to choice is rising, I do think that consumer-first lens is becoming common. And I mean, in all the work that we're doing, people are coming and saying, you know, Pierre Poilievre only wants to know how this policy is going to affect consumers. So let's figure out how that's the case. So I think that's the place to start, is you're going to be able to break down those barriers when you tell people, no one, again, is going to say at the door, you know, "Oh, nice to see you, you know, member of the legislature. Can you please reduce barriers to
internal barriers to trade?" Yeah,
not going to happen. But when they say, "Hey, I'd love it if this was cheaper," or that I had the choice of, you know, buying a bottle of BC wine in Ontario, which is really hard to find, or, you know.
And just keep it simple. Protectionism, you know, does not breed a competition. Like, if you put competition out there, then people are going to find new ways to do things. They're going to, you know, hopefully be more productive. So why not?
So I think all these questions of productivity are really hard, which is why we're having a whole conference. It's easy to talk about, we'd like to have higher productivity. It's very hard to figure out what are the appropriate policies to do. But one that is incredibly easy is reducing internal trade barriers. And look, I don't have polling on this, but I tend to think that average Canadians are really quite comfortable with knocking down all kinds of internal trade barriers. There are the barrier to removing the barriers is often there are politically connected producers in various industries who are going to lobby and say, hang on a second, provincial government, don't do this, don't do that, look what the job consequences will be. But I think in general, most Canadians are just comfortable with the idea that Canada is Canada.
Can I just add one thing that comes back to, Hannah, what you said? We're actually in an interesting environment where, because nobody actually knows what's going on anymore.
What do you mean?
Like, what I mean by that is, like, most Canadians don't know what happens in Ottawa, and I would say most Albertans don't know what happens in Edmonton, and, you know, most people living in BC doesn't know what happens in Victoria in terms of, like, the details of public policy. So in a weird way, this lack of understanding actually creates space for political leaders to actually lead and drive people and not worry about the nuance that someone's going to know that, you know, some barrier was lifted and that's going to somehow threaten somebody's job. Right? So I just think we have to, like, we always look at the downside of the fact that people are incredibly isolated, they're not getting news, they're uninformed about things. But in another way, that makes doing big things, I actually think, easier if we recognize that. And so I actually think this is the perfect moment to move past that nuance of public policy and know that no special interest anymore can get the public's attention. That the only thing that matters is how people feel about whether the economy is working for them, and that shows people know whether that's happening or not. They don't need to be told that.
Mm-hmm.
So the day may have come to talk to the public about internal barriers to trade in a way that they're actually willing to get motivated about and understand.
Or just change the policy and realize that the public is not going to even know you did it. And all that matters is that they feel the effect of it.
I want to ask you about one other sort of productivity story, a story that gets told a lot in Western Canada in particular, and each of you have different perspectives, and I'd like to know your sort of reaction to it. You've probably heard a version of this before, that if we're talking about the economy or productivity, folks in Alberta in particular and lots of Western Canada would point to LNG, liquefied natural gas, and say that, there was a time that there were 19 or 20 major projects proposed off the coast of BC. We've got one done, maybe another two or three coming, but that if we truly care about increasing productivity, increasing GDP per capita, there's probably nothing we could do that would be bigger than that. And second, there's probably also nothing that we could do that would be bigger for the global economy, global environment and economy, and specifically the environment in terms of offsetting higher emitting fuels elsewhere. So, it seems to a lot of folks within a few square kilometers of where we're sitting here that this is like a no-brainer for Canada. The best thing we could do for our economy, the best thing we could do for the global environment, let's get it done. That, until today, that argument hasn't gotten tons of traction in the middle to eastern half of Canada, I would say. Are we ready for it yet? How does that land with you now?
Let me try to give it some more traction. So when we talk about productivity and just the Canadian economy in general, we're always comparing ourselves to the United States, and that's probably not the best example we should look to. We should also be talking about, and this would help people understand that there's not just one economic model and it isn't just the United States. We should also look at a number of European countries that have higher productivity than Canada, higher GDP per capita than Canada, better standards of living than Canada in many ways. Also, by the way, almost every single one of them, in fact, every single one of them has higher taxes than Canada, and yet they get all these great economic benefits, despite the fact that they have higher taxes than Canada. They have much better economic outcomes. Okay, one of those countries, the key one that Canadians should think about, and particularly Albertans should think about, is Norway. Norway is a great example. Norway has roughly the population of Alberta, produces a little bit less oil than Alberta, I think a little bit more natural gas than Alberta. Norway has a considerably higher standard of living and quality of life than Canada. Norway is basically an amazing combination of drill, baby, drill, and the world's highest environmental standards. That is a great combination. Norway is leading the world in electric car adoption. It has extremely high, like ridiculously high gasoline taxes. You think carbon taxes are high from the feds? Like, it's like $3 a liter to buy gas in Norway. But at the same time, when the Europeans came to Norway, when the Ukraine war started and said, we need your help replacing Russian oil, they said, yeah, of course. We're gonna pump more oil, we're gonna pump more gas. And their future is pumping more oil and gas. When the Germans came to our federal government, we said, would you like to buy some hydrogen in 12 years? Because we're not pumping any more gas. No, we're not building any more gas pipelines. So to me, Norway is a really good example where it's both further to the left on environmental regulations, but it's actually further to the right on producing more oil and gas.
So just think of everything that you were just talking about there. All of those stories would sell to Canadians, and they would listen to those stories. So think about that. If you want to be able to tell positive stories like that, you have to move in that type of direction too. I would listen to all of that. So just think of that.
Okay, then I'm going to pick on the media people for a moment then,
Absolutely.
and say that
Bring it on, Scott.
I've had personal experience that a lot of Canada's national media have not been too interested in that particular story over the last 5 or so years.
Yeah.
How, or 10. how would we, as journalists and former journalists, how would we get them interested in it today?
Okay, one of my frustrations with my former employer is that there were a lot of environmental reporters. There are only 1 or 2 resource reporters. And resources in Canada need to be discussed, and they need to be discussed thoroughly. So how do we do that? Again, I come back to the fact that it's a very fractured media. Reporters are very busy, and the reason for that is there have been a lot of cutbacks, and you know this as well as I do. So for the frontline people, if you imagine what my day was when I was doing a regular story, I'd come in at 9, I get assigned a story, I'd do a live hit, I would file for locals, then I would file for radio, then I'd file for national, and then they say, oh, by the way, can you do one more hit? How much time did I have to think about developing that story? Not a heck of a lot. I do not blame the reporters for this. They're doing the very best job that they can. However, make it easy for them to tell that story. Find an example. Make it human. Tell cool stories like we just heard from you, but you make it easy for them. And I'm not saying that they're lazy. I am saying that they are extremely busy because of everything that's happened when it comes to cuts from the top. So you have to think of different ways of approaching it. Also, you have to think of different ways to tell the stories. And nowadays, when it comes to mass media, it's figuring out targeting and stay in contact with these people. Have relationships still. The reason is there's very few of them, so you know their names.
If I can just jump in just really quickly, and this may set David up for some thoughts on polling and Canadians' attitudes, but look, I think we have a political environment and a media environment that's very, very polarized. And so people are either in the oil and gas is evil camp or they're in the drill baby drill camp. And what the Premier said earlier is, there was one thing she said that I think was absolutely right, which is we shouldn't be talking about how do we reduce oil and gas. We should be talking about how do we reduce emissions. That is absolutely correct. But it is very hard to have that conversation on both the left and the right. It's increasingly become oil and gas is a moral evil on the left, and oil and gas, no, it's a moral good on the right, which is crazy, but that is kind of where I think we are.
What happened to Canada should be proud of its resource sector? I don't know, when the hockey and NHL was playing, they would introduce, welcome to oil and gas country.
Yeah.
That was on the NHL.
Our most productive sector, or second most productive sector, depending on how you sort of look at it. Dave, do you want to get in on this too? Where do you think Canadians are at on this, especially the energy sector today?
Well, I actually think most people don't have a strong view either way. You ask people, do you love or hate oil? Most people say, neither. I don't love it. I mean, maybe in Alberta you love it, and in Quebec some will hate it, but most Canadians are actually like, I think we need it, and I think we should find a way to produce it and sell it and use it in a way that has the least impact on the things I don't want to see happen. And so I come back to your Norway example, and I try to think of, as a political scientist, like if Norway was one half of a country and the other half only produced hydroelectricity, would it be able to do what it's done? And so whenever I'm in Ottawa and someone from Europe comes and says, I don't understand Canada, why don't conservatives at least talk about climate change more often in the way that UK Tories might have done in the past, or other conservative-oriented politicians in Europe might? And I said, well, to understand it, you have to understand federalism and the way that Canada's structured. And the political insight doesn't make sense. Doesn't mean the public's not there, it's the leaders who see the incentive to pull people in the other way. So that's the fundamental challenge, right, is that our structure doesn't allow for this conversation to happen. And as a result, I always say that the most divisive issue in Canada, the thing that separates people the deepest, which is tied to energy, is climate change. You're literally like on one side or the other, and there's no middle ground on whether it's a priority or not. And I come back to this basic idea that public opinion is constructed by factors and leaders that move people in a certain way. And I think what's missing is just leadership to move people there. And the incentives have been the opposite of that, but I always use Norway. I want Norway to be the example we use. And this might be a controversial thing to say to this audience given who's sponsored this conference, but I do think that Rachel Notley was attempting to find a path that designed Alberta in the lens of Norway. Was she successful? Others can argue with that. But I think that was an Alberta politician who at least knew, because of the incentives on her side, what she needed to do to convince Quebec and a government whose political anchor is Quebec to come along for the ride.
So, well,
leave it there.
Yeah, I like that. And I think the spirit of this conference is good policy ideas over politics. So I think you're welcome to point out any ideas that you thought were good, no matter where they came from. You know, I want to pick up on something you were saying and challenge each of you to tell me an area where you think it's been done well. It's easy enough to find the problem areas. Where is somewhere, it can be recent or it can be older in your career, where you've seen Canadians change their mind on an issue, and why? And why have they done that? Tony, you picked up your mic, so you have to go first.
Okay, so I'll start. So free trade with the United States is, I mean, I may have taken the low-hanging fruit here, but it is a pretty interesting example where if you asked, you know, think about it, Canada fought several national elections on free trade. We fought one in the 1890s, we fought one in 1911, and we fought one in 1988. Those earlier ones, it was all about, if we have free trade with the United States, Canada will be destroyed, Canadian culture will be annihilated, and of course it was the Conservatives who were against free trade. By 1988, things had flipped. The Liberals were against free trade and were convinced that Canada would be culturally and destroyed, and its social policies would be eviscerated and all these things. But you know what? A few years after free trade came in, the Liberals were essentially free trade, and by the time we get to the Trudeau government, we've got a government that makes it a very high priority to maintain free trade with the United States in the face of Donald Trump. So I think that's an example. And now again, there are interesting questions about exactly how beneficial that's been to Canada, but I tend to think our productivity problem would be even worse if we did not have free trade with the United States.
And I'll just slide in to say as well as we close in our last 15 minutes, if anyone from the floor has a question, just make your way up to one of the mics and I will find you. But if you don't make your way to the mic, I've got another hour or two worth of questions for this crew as well. David, are you going to go next there?
I think
what have people changed their mind on?
Another example is from soon after the free trade debate is the public opinion around the deficit and Canada's ability to remember those days, balance our budget, and how difficult that was for the Chrétien government and Paul Martin to actually do it, but he had public opinion on his side. And I think it came from you had a relentless opposition party in the Reform Party, who wasn't official opposition in the early 90s, but became it in the late 90s, who created the political space for that to happen. And so imagine, I try to think of productivity. Imagine you had an opposition that all they did every day, in the same way that they do it on affordability today, talked about productivity. So I do think that's another example of where the public will just follow, not blindly their leaders, but they take cues from the people who they send to Ottawa or provincial capitals to make those decisions for them. And so deficit fighting is another one.
I'm still sitting here trying to think of one.
Where people have fundamentally changed their mind on.
Where people have fundamentally changed their mind on something.
Well, I can buy you a minute because I see a question from the floor.
Buy me a minute.
So if we could get that mic working in the center, I think I saw Scott up there first.
I think it's on, yeah. So just to be a little bit prodding and maybe go a little bit of a different direction. So I've already heard the comment from the Deputy Governor of the Bank of Canada 3 times today. So we remember that because she said, you know, it's time to break the glass. Most of the people in this room will remember when the economists referred to the Canadian dollar as the Mexican peso when we were in big fiscal problem. So where I'm going with this, even though we don't like it, we don't like polarization, it's kind of like the campaign stuff, negative advertising works, and I wonder about the role of fear. Fear on you are going to have a worse life than your kids, your country is going to fall down the list and not be able to do anything. It seems to be the only thing that might drive people in the direction that we're talking about. We did kind of address the deficit kind of as a national project, but a lot of that came from fear. So I wonder about like shame, fear, and all those wonderful things as drivers of behavior.
Let me take this on as an approach from the media in particular, because when the deputy bank of governor came out and said this is a crisis, et cetera, those are things that highlight those are clips, they're clippable moments. So of course, when it comes to those types of things, the mass media is going to jump on that in a second and report it. I think it was reported in every national outlet. So yes, it does work in those specific instances too. I do think fear can go, and you did some excellent polling on this as well, where people, their tendency and their voting on that was at the last event we were at. I think to some point, though, you don't want to scare people so bad. I think one of the things in my program is that, we tell so much bad news that at the 20-minute mark, we had to tell something good because people are going to start tuning out. So fear works to a point, but eventually people will tune out of it. And I think that may be what's happening with a part of the younger generation when it comes to these types of things. So yes, it works to a point, but then you don't want to tune people completely out.
Tony, David, quick comment on fear, shame as a motivator, and then I know we've got a couple more questions I want to get to.
My only concern with sort of the fear is that I think we are actually in a time where people are already very fearful.
Yes.
And as David says, there is a kind of scarcity mindset. There is a things are going to get worse mindset. There is a mindset of how do I just stay where I am as opposed to backsliding. So I tend to think that there's an acute consciousness on the part of Canadians that we have some serious economic challenges. I think the bigger issue is what do we do about them?
Yeah.
And that is not obvious. I mean, there are some small obvious things like don't do incredibly stupid things with the immigration system and don't have internal trade barriers. And after that, it becomes really hard to talk about and reach quick and simple solutions about how do you raise Canada's productivity, which is why we're having this conference, because it's a difficult issue. So that's the main thing that I would say is that people would like solutions. They've already got fear.
Solutions. Just to keep us moving along, I'm going to go to the question, then you can get another one in if you want to. So the microphone on stage left there.
Yeah, thank you. At the end of the day, media, business associations, writers like Tony, Hannah, yourself, ex-CBC, can try and bring these issues to the attention of the general public. But as we've heard from the panel, very short attention spans, very complex issues, understanding whether it's regulatory, taxation, et cetera. I'm curious to what extent you think that maybe it's a reflection of a failure of the educational system to provide basic economic education at high school level so people can better understand these issues and can make better decisions on which government or parties they're going to support, understanding the consequences of some of the policies that have been made. And Tony, you touched already on immigration, and there's numerous other ones.
I would love to see more civics and more economic classes in high schools, even in junior high as well. I know my stepson, I clearly told him politically about what was happening, but that wasn't happening at his high school. So when it comes to yes, I would love to see more of that. I don't know if I blame the education system, but it would more civics. It would be really important. But just to come back on, I don't want to be too negative about the media or if I was sounding negative and people's attention spans. Here's my positive thing. Here's my switch.
Okay.
I think people are coming back. I think things are a pendulum. Right now, and when I maybe left, we talked a lot in sound bites, and it's extremely frustrating for me. I didn't want to just talk in sound bites. I think people are switching to longer form podcasts, for example, listening to those because they want to listen to public policy a bit more and not just hear those snippets. So yes, when it comes to younger generations, maybe, but I think they are eventually going to switch back as well, where they feel they need to know a bit more about what's happening in public policy today.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I agree. I think there's opportunities there, but I don't know if that's the solution to the problem we are facing today. Like, how many of you can think of a time recently that Pierre Poilievre used the term productivity, right? So even if voters were fully informed, are the choices on the menu clear to them on who's going to make that a priority, right? In his 4 things that he's going to do, I don't think productivity plays a role. Build the homes, axe the tax,
Pump the productivity.
stop crime, fix the budget, right? Some of that might lead to more productivity, but there's no vision around unleashing the Canadian economy that he thinks he needs to communicate to the public. So I think, again, I'm kind of beating a dead horse here. It comes back to the leadership question, right? And you don't need to, and Tony, I think this is what you said, like, what are the actual items on the menu that Canadians are going to be asked to choose from that actually help solve this problem? Because no one's going to run on, sorry, Scott, eliminating internal trade barriers.
What? Not a
Right?
not a
It's
winning
not going to be
election
chapter
strategy.
one of the Red Book in the next federal election. That being said, doesn't mean a government can't do it if it has this clear goal and it's made a commitment to grow the economy and make everybody feel that they are doing better off. So I think it will help. I'm always, as a pollster, also though mindful, it sounds very elitist, of like everybody being experts. I don't want Canadians to believe they know everything about everything, right? Because then imagine the chaos of that kind of a world.
Well, right now we have a gender lens
Go ahead.
on all of the legislation that comes out. Why not put a productivity lens?
I've heard that idea. Okay, we've got time for one more question, then I'll give you each a chance to wrap up if you had a final thought, but I want to squeeze it in. So, yeah, over here at the microphone.
Thank you. My question goes back to the beginning of the conversation today. I'm curious about communicating reskilling and upskilling for workers who are being asked to adopt more AI or adopt technology. So I think two examples were given about agriculture and then the port worker story about union workers not wanting to adopt technology even though they potentially had more jobs to go to. I think a big conversation is around retraining and moving from one type of skill set to another type of skill set. And I think economists have talked about that for years, but people haven't seen it in practice. So I'm really curious about communicating practical examples about people transitioning, especially in a mid-stage of life, where they also have to pay bills and take care of their kids and pay the mortgage.
Yeah, I want to jump in on this because one of the things that I think is vital as AI is just going to be growing immensely, generative AI, we have to help Canadians understand what this is, right from the basics. How many of you in this room have started reading about AI? Maybe a bit here and there, but also our members of parliament, our legislative MLAs, local politicians, so that everybody understands what an impact this will have on our lives. Our lives are going to be completely different in 5 and 10 years from now. But if we don't take the fear out of it by communicating this, then it's going to be the misunderstandings like we're hearing out at the ports where they don't want to transition into these jobs. When you have to help them understand. That's the very first thing, and I don't know as a country we're doing that quite well yet.
So to answer this, I'm going to sort of come back to where I started with the Lucien Bouchard story. So Lucien Bouchard says, Quebecers, Canadians, you got to work harder, and also we got to cut your social services because they're too wealthy and we can't afford them, and it's making you lazy. All wrong. And it comes back to this, which is we actually need stronger social services and more retraining and a better education system and more opportunities to enter the education system in your 20s and your 30s and your 40s and get more education. We need all those things. Those are things that drive productivity, aside from making people's lives better. It's not about less of that. It's not a scarcity agenda. It has to be an abundance agenda, which is how we get to more abundance. But again, we tend to talk about a lot of these things in exactly the opposite way. Like we have to cut taxes and we have to have fewer social services and some magic thing is going to happen with productivity if we do that. And I think that's just upside down.
Great. Well, I know we could go on forever. We're right at time, so maybe I'll just give each of you a chance to wrap up with this one quick question, which is everyone who's in this room today has a policy idea that they're trying to sell to somebody else, that they're trying to communicate to somebody else. A practical, tangible bit of advice that you give to one of those folks.
Oh my gosh. Oh,
you go first.
I'm going to build off just the end. I'm not going to answer
You get 30
your question.
seconds each.
But
Then
here's
we'll
what I'll
release
say.
everyone to
When you
lunch.
ask Canadians, what brings you joy and happiness to your life? Only 4% put work in their top 3. If you ask Canadians, do you want to work less and get more? they will say yes. So that is the key to, I think, convincing people to embrace a productivity agenda. And it starts with them feeling confident that if my job changes or if I needed to find a new one, there's the support there to help me do it. But at the end of the day, literally nobody wants to work harder than they do now. And so that, I think, is the way to convince them of anything, that it's going to mean more wealth, higher quality of life, more joy in their life, and less time doing the thing they don't want to do.
Work less, make more joy.
To communicate this, you can't just say it once. If you have a great policy idea, unfortunately you say it once and maybe a couple of people hear it. They tune out. You have to say it over and over and over again, and make sure you're communicating to your neighbors, to younger people. Try doing that, because if the public starts to understand this more, then you're going to have more people talk about it. But you can't just do it once and think, okay, everybody has heard this. Even if you do make one article in the Globe and Mail, continue to tell those stories.
When you're just getting sick of saying it, they're just starting to notice. Tony, a practical bit of advice.
And I would say, like, again, you've got to be able to tell, even if it's a very, very complicated story, you've got to be able to tell it simply. And you've got to have some simple point. So sometimes I'm asked by people, how do you write an op-ed? And I'll say, well, okay, here's an example, how to have a simple point. The Manhattan Project, build an atomic bomb. The Apollo Project, put a human being on the moon. I can say both of those in one very short sentence. Actually doing it is incredibly complicated and involved hundreds of thousands of people and trillions of dollars, but I can tell you what we're trying to do in a simple sentence. And I think that's the key in selling any policy.
And say it over and over and over.
Well, thank all three of you for those practical tips. Thank you for digging in on this panel and answering questions from the floor. Thanks all of you for joining us in person and those of you who are online. And now it's my pleasure to be able to release you for a short break, and we'll catch you again soon. Thanks.